Hi, I'm Captain Mike. In this video, I'm going to show you how I make a two-piece 3D mold to cast, in this case, pumpkins. Now, this mold that I'm going to show you how I make can be used for anything that doesn't have serious undercuts. It can be a sphere or a little squat vase or something. As long as it doesn't have undercuts, it can be made in the type of mold that I'm going to show you how I make. Now, before we get into that mold, I'm going to show you the first one that I did, and it wasn't real successful, but it did actually produce some pumpkins, just very hard to use. This request to make these pumpkins came from my daughter, who thought that it would be a really great seasonal thing to add to our line. So I gathered up some styrofoam pumpkins of different sizes and made these molds. So let me show you the first one that I done first. Now, this is the first mold, pumpkin mold, that I made, and as you can see, it's round. Not a problem with that, really. It seemed to me at the time the easiest way to do it. Wasn't thinking real clearly, but I got me a bucket, sort of like this one. Got me a styrofoam pumpkin like this. Pulled out the little stem and covered all of this in here with clay. Just made it smooth it out because we're going to make the thing without the stem in it. We're going to hand mill the stem. Looks sort of like this right here when I covered it with clay. Because this is actually the top. The bottom was going to be, it had something like this on it, and it sat like this. So what I did is I put the pumpkin, suspended the pumpkin in this bucket, or poured plaster in it about halfway, pushed it down in there. And the idea was to totally immerse the pumpkin in plaster. Sounded like a great idea. No measuring, no nothing much. So I did that, and left the little hole up here so that when I got through, I'd have something in the mold to pour plaster through. And I had this really swell, solid piece when it came out. It was solid. That was another great idea. I said, hey man, I got this. This is going to be a great idea. I cut the pumpkin right down the middle with my bandsaw, and I had two pieces like this. Of course, it cut the pumpkin in two also, and it ruined that pumpkin. You couldn't use it again, but I didn't care. I didn't plan to carry this very far and make a lot of molds. So I started trying to dig the pumpkin out of here, and it wouldn't come very easily. It had nothing to do with the plaster adhering to the styrofoam. It was the undercuts, the way the pumpkin was in this particular cut. So after a little digging, I put the two pieces back together as best I could, took them back in my shop, and cut it into 4 ways. I got the mold, the old pumpkin out, the styrofoam pumpkin out, and I had this. So that was great. Now I just had to figure out how to get it back together to pour it. And that wasn't a problem either. I got these straps. So the first problem I come with was getting it to go together nice and neat, because there were no register marks. There was nothing in here that would make it go together one certain way. So I had to just kind of figure out how to do it by bouncing it around like that. Hold it together with straps as I went along. So we're going to do that right quick, and I'll speed it up so you don't have to watch it. Now, that's how I get it together. And you can tell there's a lot of beating and bumping to get all these surfaces here lined up. Because if they're not all lined up, nice and smooth, just like I cut them to start with, on the top and bottom, you're going to get a pumpkin that's got lines in it that don't work. And that's not good. So we got the thing together exactly how we wanted it, and we poured our slip in here. Now on these pumpkins, I'm using Georgia red clay, river clay. A slip I make, and I have a video on that if you want to know how to make slip from clay, but that's another story. So we got this thing poured and let it sit about 30 minutes. That Georgia clay, it sets up pretty fast. Poured out and set. Now I'll just go ahead and tell you that through experience I found out I had to let the clay sit in this pot or this mold 24 to 36 hours. I had to let it set up really, really good. And here's why. Unmolding this thing is a beast. First you'd have to take the bottom one loose and completely away. Then you have to hold this thing as best you can with all your arms and legs and fingers and take this top one off, because this rascal wants to come apart. That's not a bad thing in a way. The bad thing is you can't let the pumpkin fall out. You have to take one piece loose first, sliding it sideways, then watching this part, take this one loose, move it here, and then somehow get your hand under the pumpkin so that it won't fall, and slide it. And if that stuff is not set, if the pumpkin's not set up, the clay's not set up properly, it's going to want to collapse with you. If it's not firm, the whole pumpkin will want to collapse. And if it is firm enough, you have to move it out, away, and set it somewhere to dry a little more. To start with, I was losing half the pumpkins that I made out of this mold. I finally got it down to where I don't lose but a couple out of maybe a fourth, if that many. But it's aggravating. So I decided I'd make a new kind of mold. And that's what this video is about. I'm going to show you how I make a simpler, easier to use mold. Here is what we're going to make. This is the finished product. Now this is the second set of these molds that I have made. I've made a set of 3 of the smaller pumpkins. I have yet to make the second mold of the big pumpkin, but I will, and I'm going to make it the same way that I make these. But these are the molds that you will end up with. And of course, as is with plaster, once you get them molded, you've got to let them sit for quite a while to dry out before you can use them. But that's a given, okay? So here's what you're going to need to pull this little project off. And if I'm bright enough and I don't have a senior moment, I'll put it all in the comments below. Start with, you're going to need something to cast. We're going to use this one. This is just one that kind of came with this mold. But we're going to use this pumpkin. And I'll explain more about that later, but we're going to need a pumpkin. You're going to need a piece of PVC pipe or something similar. And I'll explain that in a minute. You're going to need some wood to make your mold out of. You'll need a bottom and 4 sides. You can make it out of plywood. You can make it, this is made out of old sawmill lumber. Run it off my sawmill. I have not planed it. I have not done anything. It will work. Any kind of wood that's big enough to make your mold. You will need a screwdriver. I use an electric drill. You can use a regular screwdriver, but you're going to also need a drill bit to drill some holes in this wood so that you won't have to screw all the way through both sets of wood. You'll just pilot drill some holes. You guys know that. You're going to need plaster. Where's it at? Ah, here it is. I show you guys this every time I do something to do with plaster. You're going to need some plaster. I use this industrial plaster from Georgia Pacific. Get online and Google where the closest to you can get 50 pounds of this plaster. It's not mold making plaster. It's used in the granite industry here, but it works. And if you don't use something that you can buy for about $12 for 50 pounds. You're going to spend a small fortune making these molds, buying that stuff from Hobby Lobby. Not a problem with that. Hobby Lobby's got to make some money. Not going to make it off of me with plaster. So there you go. You're going to need plaster wherever you get it. You're going to need some screws. I use sheetrock screws long enough to go through the wood that I'm using and into the second piece of wood. You're going to need some vegetable oil. I use this to spray on the wood, the inside of the mold, and plaster won't stick to it. If you put a little of this on it, it won't stick at all. I use some mold release. You can use whatever you want on the plastic parts, the styrofoam and this part right here. I spray them really good with this. It helps them to come out of the mold. It really does. And you'll need some petroleum jelly. The petroleum jelly is going to be used, as you will see, to help the mold separate, and a couple other little tricks that we'll get to in the mold. But that should be pretty much the supply list, unless I run up on something else while I'm making this thing, and I'll tell you about it. Oh yeah, you'll need something to measure with. Don't forget that, okay? And that is the supplies you're going to need. This is what your mold is going to look like when you get it together. And I show you this one to start with so that you'll have some idea where we're going. This piece here is very important because after you've done all your math, and we'll explain about the math, you use this to hold the mold off the master off the bottom. As you can see, I've got a little circle drawn around it there, and I have some little marks on the end. The marks on the end correspond with the marks here, so that whenever I get all this done, it lines up and everything's center of the mold. Now, one thing I forgot to mention, you'll need some glue. I use E6000, and you will take it and you will glue this using 4 little dabs, just a little bit, you don't want to use a lot, 4 little dabs, and let it sit there. And that will center that up so that when you take it and put it down here and line it up with these marks, everything's lined up, okay? That's just a little prep right there. What I'm talking about, the other prep is you'll need to take your little piece of PVC pipe that you're going to use for the hole to pour stuff in when you get your mold made, and you will glue that. And I usually use silicone for this. It's just tube silicone. You can use the E6000, and I just glue it right to the top, just like you see here. Now this is going to be the bottom of your mold. Where you have cleaned up the top and pulled out the stem is going to be the top of your mold, and that's going to go down. So while you're prepping all this stuff and cutting your wood, go ahead and glue this piece here. And I'm fixing to tell you next how you determine what size to make this. So let's try that. I'll put this mold up right here. You notice this is just made out of scrap plywood. I mean, it's just scrap. Anything works. Now before you start, and before we start, let me say this. I apologize for this being a long video. I sometimes get kind of ragged out because I talk too much. I don't know any other way to do it. So if I still have your attention and you're still interested, I appreciate it. If you're bored, YouTube is just full of really swell stuff that's kind of people want to watch. I check out things all the time and go move elsewhere. So not going to hurt my feelings, but if you want to see how this is done, stay with me. Now, what we're going to do is you want to determine the dimensions, inside dimensions of your mold, the wood you're going to cut. And the way I do that is I need to know these dimensions right here and these dimensions right here of my master. I need to know that first. And there's several ways of doing it. I won't get really into it to bore you a whole lot, but just to give you an idea, you can do no more than take pieces of wood like this, and then measure between them. Okay? Just measure between them. That gives you the width. And you can kind of do the same thing on the height. You can, before you put this little puppy here on, you can lay a piece of wood across that and measure up from that to the bottom. That'll give you top to bottom measurements. Write those down. Now, here's the important part. What size do I make my mold? I like to use a separation on both sides, top and bottom, of at least 2.5 inches, possibly 3. The bigger your mold, the more plaster you want, because the plaster does the work. It absorbs the water from the plaster and makes this clay set up. So using those dimensions, you're going to cut your wood to suit. So, you know, if this is 5 inches, let's say, and you won't go 2.5 each side, then you're going to need a bottom piece that's 10 by 10. I mean, 10 by 10. You know that, so you got that. And once you got that, you have to decide, you got 2.5 inches here on the bottom, 2.5 inches here. You go cut your piece of PVC to 2.5 inches and glue it to the top. So what happens if you do all your sides right, when you put this thing down in here with this glued to it, it's going to suspend itself off the bottom of the mold perfectly, 2.5 inches. This will allow you to have 2.5 inches on the top, and your sides, if you cut them the bottom correctly and put it all around, then you'll have 2.5 all the way around. That's your mold. That's how you get your dimensions, and that is important. Now, to determine your size of the sides, it just takes a little common sense. And I'll throw in here now, I use a table saw. I'm not telling you you can't do this with a hand saw or with a skill saw. Anything's possible, but it just takes a long time. If you're using a power saw and you're cutting this small stuff, be careful. Them power saws will jump with you and I don't want you to cut yourself, so please be careful. But once you have your bottom, you already know that 2 of your sides are going to be exactly this width, because this is the easy way. You just go ahead and make 2 of the sizes. On the table saw, I set it up, I run a few pieces through and then I size them the way I need to, but they're going to all be the same width. Now, for this side, as you know, I like to drill into them this way, screw into them that way. So, you have to put these sides here, hold them nice and firm, maybe with some clamps, whatever you think you need, and then once you get them square, because you want to make sure everything's square, that they're not leaning in, not leaning out, you can do the measurements from outside to outside. Measure twice, cut once. Very, very important. And you'll need 2 of those. So once you get those done, and you got those cut, you're home free. So what we're going to do now is I'm going to screw this together. I'll speed up the video so you don't have to get bored with that. But we're going to just put it together with my nifty, thrifty little drill here. And that's what we're going to do. Well, let's get at it. Well, I lied to you. I didn't fast forward through putting this box together, but you didn't need to see how this box goes together. Anybody can figure that out. And it was a good thing, too. Because, like all of us woodworkers, and especially working with wood that's not all of the same dimensions, I made some tiny little calculation errors, which is another good thing because I can show you what to do to fix those things. So here's your mold in its rough form, in which it'll stay in its rough form. But inside, you can see right up here, it doesn't fit as tight as the rest of the mold. So there's a little gap right there. So what are you going to do? Well, you have a lot of choices. You can take regular modeling clay and skeech it down in that crack, or you can take Vaseline and smear it all down, making sure it goes down in the crack. In fact, I suggest that you take Vaseline and go over all the cracks, even if they look tight. Just up the edges of the joints, down the bottom of the joints. And I'll do that before I pour the plaster in here, because plaster, if you mix it thin enough, so the bubbles will rise, it'll find a place to go and it'll come out all over your table, your floor, whatever. But that's what we have here. We have this. And the next thing we're going to do is we're going to get a piece of wood, and I'll have to go get a piece of wood, but you want to get a piece of wood that you can cut to exactly this size right here. Now here's how we're going to find the center of our mold, and this piece that's going to sit on the top. And first, decide which side you want to use. It doesn't really matter. In this case, we've got about 10.5 inches, and I don't have a pencil. Something else you're going to need. Come over here to the side and mark it. Make you a nice fat mark. Come over on this side and do the same thing. Now I know some of this is just sort of you all figure it out on your own, and again I apologize, but I got to get there, so I might as well video it. Alright, that's your first center mark. Okay, now you got this well piece of wood. It don't have to be this thick, it can be whatever you want it to be. It just needs to be straight, and I find that it's better if it's about the size of the PVC pipe you're using. I'll show you that in a minute. Now what you do is you'll take this, you'll go ahead and just kind of eyeball it to where it needs to be and put your mark under it. And then you cut it off. Now once it's cut off to size, this is all just for convenience. It's just nice and easy to eyeball everything. Mark the center of this piece. Same way, just come in here with your measuring device, and this is about 2.5 inches, so makes it easy. Put you a mark on each end. Now, you know, this is not rocket science. If you miss it by 1/16 of an inch or something, it's not really a big deal. But the closer you can get it, the better you are. So now you have this. And the next thing you've got to do is figure out where this is going to go on this. And what I'm going to do is sort of eyeball it. Just kind of eyeball it. You'll go take you something and say, well, gee, that's 4 inches there. What is it over here? It's almost 4 inches, so I'll take half of that. 3 7/8. 3 7/8. That's perfect. Then you take your pencil and mark it. That is where you're going to glue this. And I just take, you can use E6000. I mean, a lot of times on this I would use just silicone, but it dries a little slower, so we're going to do this. I just take a bead of it and go around this. Well, actually you don't have to go around it. You just put it about 4 places, because you're going to break this loose. Okay, you're going to have to take this off, so just put about 4 little spots on that. Stick it on there and center it up, and it'll dry. Just set it aside to dry. Put your cap back on your E6000. Nobody forgets to do that, right? Okay, so you have your mold ready to go, your master mold, or not master mold, your master styrofoam pumpkin ready to go. And now all you've got to do is grease this thing on the inside with this and line all the joints with petroleum jelly, which I use. And you're ready to start mixing. After this dries, you're ready to start mixing your plaster. So let's let this dry just a little bit. We'll come back and we'll have this all done. Okay, we're about ready to pour the plaster. But before we mix up the plaster, let me just give you a couple more little pro tips, if you will. You need to put a mark on your master, if you will, your pumpkin, a halfway mark, because you do not want to overfill the mold the first time. It's going to take 2 pours for this. You want it to hit, the first pour to hit exactly right here, halfway. Anything over that will make it difficult to get the styrofoam piece out of the plaster when it dries, and also will give you great problems when you pour the clay. So you do that. And another really good tip is to drill you 2 holes, one right here and one right here, so that you can affix this to the mold and it won't move. Now the reason we do this, the reason we glue it, and the reason that we put the little screws, is because once you start to push this down into the plaster, if you don't have all this done, this is going to want to wobble. It's going to want to move. It's not going to stay, you know, the pressure of the plaster is going to push it up. So you've either got to drill holes so that you can screw this down, or you're going to have to use a lot of heavy weights like this to hold it down. That's your choices. But I would go with drilling the holes, or you can use the heavy weights, whatever you want to do. And the last thing that I do, because the first bit of plaster I pour is just going to be into this empty mold, is I put me a mark. Can you see the mark? Right here? Right there? That's about 3 inches up. Okay? You don't want to pour it all the way so that this will be, you know, this will go in level when you do it, because the styrofoam will displace plaster and it'll make it come up too high. You want to make the final pour by hand. So just pour in enough so that it's easy to do, it's easy to pour, you can bump your mold, you can get the bubbles to rise. Okay, with that said, we're going to go ahead and mix up the plaster and pour it in, and then I'll come back and we'll push this down at that time and I'll screw it in and show you. And then we'll let it sit until, you know, I'll say a couple hours. Maybe I'll get to it this afternoon. And then we'll show you how to make the second pour so that you'll have a 2-piece mold. I've mixed up a batch of plaster to start with. The hardest part of this is knowing how much plaster to mix so that you don't overmix or undermix. I know there should be a mathematical formula where you could do volume kind of thing, and I should know that, but I don't at this particular point. So I just mix up a bunch, because if I have it left over, then I have all these little molds that I keep handy to make these little plaster things out of, depending on the season and what I want to make. I also have some other plaster molds or casting molds. You can do this. If nothing else, you could pour it into a flat or round baking pan and make you a nice bat, plaster bat, which comes in really handy for things. So, with all that said, just this thing is so hard to pick up full like this, I go ahead and start with this nice little mixing cup and just pour it in, and try not to make any more bubbles than you can help. Bubbles are not your friend. And so you'll just keep on filling here and watching your little line that you put in there, and don't get above that. Sometimes I don't mix enough, but if you're really quick, you can go ahead and mix up some more plaster and pour it on top of what you've got to complete the pour. Never had a failure doing that. Some people may say not to do that. I don't know. I can only tell you what I do and how it works for me, and hope that that's just a starting point for you. So we're almost there. Looks like we might be a little short again. These bigger molds are extremely, extremely hard to get right. Maybe one of these days, if I live long enough, I'll do the math and I'll save myself some trouble, but probably not. You need a little hammer or a piece of wood or something that you can bump on this mold and get the bubbles to rise, because you're going to have bubbles in your plaster and you want to get them out if you can. Now when the bubbles rise, and for the sake of this video, I'm going to not worry about too much about bubbles. The ones that rise in there that just don't pop on their own, get you some alcohol, spray it in there on top of those bubbles, and they will go away. Those are the most important bubbles. The ones that will stick to this when you put it down, they cause you little issues. So what we're going to do is we're going to put our pumpkin in there, and you know, like the dummy that I am, I glued it to the mark on the wrong thing. But you can eyeball it, just eyeball it like that, and then screw it down right quick. Don't take much. This is my preferred method. It looks pretty close. Now, as it turns out, my pumpkin is barely touching the plaster. I'm almost positive that I'm going to need more plaster mixed up. Don't know, but we will see. So we'll go ahead, and now that I can pour this, we will pour it and just see where we stand. Be real careful about putting plaster down your drain. Don't do that if you can help it, because it will mess your drain up. All right, pour it without making. Well, let me skeech off some of these bubbles again. I don't want to pour them in. Bubbles just keep rising. There you go. That looks a lot better. And try not to do any splashing. If anything does splash up on the pumpkin above that black line, we'll address that when we make the second pour. So yes, I am. I'm going to have to mix up quite a bit more plaster. So let me go ahead and do that, and I'll be right back. I have my second batch of plaster mixed up, and we're going to pour in and finish this first half of the mold. Now, I have not told you how to mix the plaster, because there are plenty of good videos online on YouTube, including one I have, that tells you how to mix plaster. My advice would be to look at several of them, at least two, and compare notes on how different people mix plaster, and learn all you can before you start mixing. Hopefully you guys know all about mixing plaster, and you can go ahead and get your pour over with and all that. Okay, we're up to about halfway now, more or less. Like I said before, this is not rocket science. It's just sort of something you do. Okay. We don't have a lot of bubbles, but that will complete the first pour. And just like I told you, I got a pile of plaster left over. I do it every time. But that's okay. I have these little molds here. And we will go ahead and pour those full of plaster, and we'll wait for this to dry. It's been a couple hours since we poured this plaster, and it has set up enough so that we can go to the second stage. Now, plaster warms up somewhat as it sets, and you can feel it in this vat that I poured with some of the extra plaster, and you can feel it inside of here. But what I'm going to do is I'm going to remove this mold and go ahead and mark it so I know what goes where, and wiggle this master and get it out. It just comes out very easy. See, just like that. That's all it takes. Now, why I did that is I have to do something to this mold so that I'll be able to use it when it is when it's finished. The first thing I've got to do is right in here, right along here, there's going to be a ridge where the plaster kind of came up. I'm going to scrape that down somewhat, and I'm also going to take and put 2 registers. That is, I'm going to cut dimples right here and right here with a spoon, believe it or not, and that way those dimples, when I pour the next batch in here, will make a male dimple that'll fit in there, and then this will always go back the same way. Some people use ping pong balls, little round balls, and while the original plaster pour is wet, they'll embed this in there halfway, and then that gives them an automatic one. But I find it much easier to do what I'm fixing to show you. Let me go behind my magic curtain here. Get my coffee stirring spoon, and all you have to do is wiggle this back and forth like this and just dig out a dollop like that, okay? And just dig it deep though. You want it to be like that. See? You'll dig them out. This is the male part that'll form on the second pour. So about like that. Just enough so that they will mate each other up. So let me go ahead and dig those, and then I'll show you how I scrape around this and how I check this for any splashed up plaster. Alright, I've got my holes dug, or my register marks, whatever you want to call them. Got one here, got one here, and there's a lot of debris. And I've also scraped around this edge with this. I use a single edge razor blade to do that. You do whatever you need to do. Just kind of scrape around the edges. Just enough to take the little lip off. The raised lip, not down in it, just flat. You make that a little flat right there. And there's a lot of debris, and we'll get that out of there in just a minute. But we will first, what I do is I take and get all the splatters off of this that I can find. Just like this. They come off that easy. Just kind of get them off. It'll just come right off like that. So I do that, and then I spray it again with release and put it back in there. So let me go ahead and clean this out, and I'll show you the last step before we report. All right, it's all cleaned out. It's nice and neat inside. Got all the debris off of this one. So what we're going to do now is we're going to fix it so the mold halves won't stick together. Now, this is what I do. You may have a better idea. You may have done this many times, and you just have a better idea. And that's fine. That's good. I'm just trying to show you what I have learned and what works for me with the equipment that I have available. I take this petroleum jelly and a little brush, and I liberally brush it just like I was painting something all on the inside of this mold. Whoops, excuse me about that. I don't put it in here. I just put it around the edges, right along here, and in these, make sure you get it in these holes. And that should be fine. It always has been, to keep it from sticking together. Got a little debris in there again. See if I can't get it out. Let it drop. It got some stuff loose. But that's not a problem. We'll get it out of here. I don't think it would be a problem anyway. So there we have that. So we're going to take our we're going to take our petroleum jelly and we're going to paint this surface with it. And that will keep it from sticking. And I know this works. So far I have not had one single failure doing it this way. Always a first time. Always a first time for everything. But a good liberal painting of it, making sure you've got it all. You get a little on the sides of the mold, it will not hurt anything. Now here's just a suggestion. I don't know that this really helps any, but I like to do it anyway. This has got to come out of the mold. I mean, when you break all this stuff loose, this has got to come out of the mold. I've got it sprayed with this mold release, but I'm just going to go ahead and put a little bit of this on it just because it's an extra precaution and it won't hurt a thing. And that is, I wouldn't put it on this because the petroleum jelly does have a texture to it and it's just liable to mess your mold up on the inside. I don't know that for sure, but I think that might happen. Now with that done, you can take your mold, your master, I'll get it right in a minute, I'm sorry, and set it back down where it came from. It should fit right back in there just fine. And you will put your screws back in it and we'll mix up the plastering for it. My plaster's mixed up. Probably going to have to do two batches again, but we'll see. So we go ahead and we pour it into the mold right on top of what we have poured and scooped out our little register marks and put our petroleum jelly, and we go ahead and just pour this in. And again, I use this this little cup here because right now this is a little too heavy to pick up, and this little cheap Dollar Tree plastic might collapse with me if I try to pick it up with all the plaster in it. So we'll go ahead and do this. We're almost to the top of our pumpkin. We won't need a whole lot more. We may very well have enough. So let's just see here. We're going to bump it a little bit. Got a lot of bubbles up there. That's got the bubbles off of it. And let's see if we can pick this up and pour it. We want to pour it right to the top of the mold. Boy, it's going to be close. Going to be close. I may have to mix up just a little bit. Not much, just a little bit. Okay, we've got the last of it to pour in here. We're going to pour it all the way up to the top. And that's going to be just about the right amount. Not going to be any left over whatsoever. Okay, there we go. We've got company coming in the door. All right, my mold's set overnight. Plaster's set up good. Next we're going to take the wood part of the mold box off, and then we'll separate the mold and see what we have. Okay, let's go ahead and see if we can open this up. I have not had any trouble doing this in the past. We're going to see how it works today. I have this little wedge here, and what I do is I find a seam, place the little wooden wedge in the seam, and I tap it. And you'll notice it separating. You usually don't have to do it on both sides, but we will. Okay. Now we'll pick it up, and out it comes. There's half of the styrofoam, And here is your mold, complete with a little registration. Dimples, however. This is this part right here is a little difficult, and we'll see how it works. Sometimes this comes right on out real easy. Sometimes you have to tap on it a ways, a bit. So I have this little spare piece of PVC pipe, and I put it right there, and I just hit it. Hit my finger. Okay, here we go. Hit it one more time. It's already just about out. Well, this didn't move any. Well, a little surprise on this mold, folks. And you have no way of knowing these things, okay? But it's going to be all right. My master was hollow, okay? And so as I drove this piece of PVC through here, it just simply drove out the other part. Now this is the only time this has ever happened. And there's no way you can know, really, and it doesn't hurt anything. You're still going to have a mold, but we'll have to take this out here a little differently. When I drove that piece of PVC through there, it just simply knocked off the top. So there you go. So we're going to dig this out, and I'll show you what we got, okay? That wasn't too hard to do. I got it out. And this is unusual for this type of mold, and you really don't have any way of knowing, at least I don't, that it's a hollow mold, because most of mine are like this, and they're solid, and they dry right on out. So not a big deal. You could use this over if you wanted to, but for $1, $1.25 to Dollar Tree, it doesn't matter. So what we have here now is our mold, and it needs to be dried. So you'll find that the registration marks hopefully line up just like that, and you will have a mold. So what I have for you is this one, which one I've used before, and we're going to take out one of the pumpkins that you're going to get. And I've used these many times. They work just absolutely great. Take it apart. Top comes right off. And here's your pumpkin. Comes right out. And there you go. That only leaves one thing for me to do. Every pumpkin needs a stem. And since you had to remove the stem that came on these little things to make your mold, you have to make you a little stem. Just freehand it however you like. And when you do, make sure you push the little part down like that, the little base of the stem, kind of push it kind of like that. And I'll tell you why. You go ahead and put you some slip on it. Just like this. Lots and lots of slip. And then skeech this thing down on it really good until all the air bubbles come out. If you leave air bubbles underneath that stem, then when you cook this baby, it's going to blow your stem off. So do that. And go ahead and kind of feather out what you got for your stem. And now all you have to do is set this aside, let it dry leather hard, and clean up the mold marks, fire it, glaze it, and there you go. So, that is how I do a 3D two-piece mold out of plaster. As I said, you can make spheres, you can make anything that doesn't have an undercut. And the beauty of this system is you can use all of this wood over here, put it back together, and if you're fortunate enough and your little pumpkin master isn't hollow and it comes out in one piece, you can use it all over again, make another mold, make as many molds as you want. So that's it. That's really all there is to this. Appreciate it if you have stayed through this video. I'm sure it's a long one. And yes, I donate to St. Jude's every month, and you should too. So that's my video. I hope you enjoyed it. I'm Captain Mike, and I'm out of here.